Hey guys, MetalJesus here, and I'm back with another Patreon question. This one comes from Electric Outcast, and he asks, is there a game in your collection that took you a long time to complete? Example, it took me 27 years to complete Super Mario World and over 30 years to complete Super Mario Bros. For the original NES. Great question, and to help me answer this, I've assembled a bunch of content creators, and we're going to start with my buddy Reggie.
Hey guys, so the game I chose was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3, The Manhattan Project. And a funny story behind this game, I actually skipped over it because Turtles 4, Turtles in Time, was out for the Super Nintendo at the time. So my parents would typically only get games on birthdays and Christmases. I decided to get Turtles in Time. And that was the closest experience I was going to get to an arcade game. You know, the arcades were like really popping back in the day, and I felt like the Super Nintendo game was going to be like the best version for me. I could have chose Manhattan Project, but I think I made the right decision going over it and going for Turtles in Time. Now, it wasn't until I want to say maybe 3-4 years ago, I finally picked up and played Manhattan Project. And I thought it was actually a really good game. I'm surprised that I just kind of like slept on it over the years. I want to say like it had some cool exclusive features, like certain characters that were maybe only in a couple episodes of the series. Like there was Ground Chuck, the other one, what's his name, Dirtbag. They're actually bosses in the game, so I thought that was really cool. And I'm happy that I beat the game because I felt like Konami did a real solid effort making that game, polishing that game from Turtles 2, the arcade game, which I felt like was kind of like missing something for me on the NES back in the day. And I feel like Manhattan Project could have been a cool arcade game if they wanted it to be.
One game in my collection that took me a long time to beat was Battletoads for the NES. This also happens to be one of my favorite games in my collection and also one of the hardest games in my collection. I have a love-hate relationship with Battletoads. I love to hate the game because this is not a game for kids. Like, if you've ever played this game, you can understand the rage I have for it. Like, this game kind of confuses me. Is it a beat 'em up? Is it a platformer? Why are there racing elements in the turbo tunnel? Oh my god, don't even get me started on the turbo tunnel. I actually only recently finished this game as of 2020 only because a friend of mine, T-Belly, called me out on one of his live streams and I just had to beat the game. Battletoads is a very different experience, and the reason it took me 4 years to beat this game is because I rage quit a lot. Like, I love the game because it's constantly challenging me, but I hate the game because it's so dang hard. But I am glad I can say that I finally beat Battletoads for the NES.
A game that took me years to complete, probably about 25 if I'm accurate, was Altered Beast. Still really difficult by today's standards, but back in 1991, me, my stepsister and my brother just sat and were glued to the massive CRT TV trying to beat this game, but unfortunately dying every time. And it wasn't until over the last couple of years that I've managed to actually beat the game. And if you play it from start to finish on a good run, you can actually complete it pretty darn quickly. But I remember the day I completed it. Unfortunately, I wasn't streaming, but I was sat here on this LG TV behind the camera and I beat Altered Beast, and I was absolutely ecstatic. But even going back to it now, it's still really tricky to play, but it's fun and it's very just difficult in terms of its controls, but I can add it to my gaming credentials as a game that I finally beat as an adult.
Enduro Racer came out in 1987 or 88 for the Sega Master System, and it wasn't until 2017 that I beat it for an episode of GameSack. So that's like 30 years that it took me to beat that game. Yep, I've been trying every day, and I haven't played it since.
27 years to complete Super Mario World. Okay, that is bad. That is quite bad. I cannot top that. But I think I can speak for all gamers when I say this. That we have a lot of games that we just know in our hearts that we are never gonna finish. But one game that came to mind that simply took forever to complete, I remember, was Tales of Cysteria. Such, like, too long of a game. I was so sick and tired of this game by the end of that game, but I made it through. I beat it. But yeah, this was definitely a game that took me more than 1 year to complete. And like another game that comes to mind is actually Dragon Quest Builders 2. It took me over a year to finish that one as well.
So I've been thinking about this question, and it's a little bit more difficult than I had thought, because there's plenty of games that I've been trying to beat over the last 30 years that I haven't been able to, but very few that I have. But one that I have that I'm pretty damn proud of is Ninja Gaiden on the original Nintendo. Man, that game was very, very hard as a kid. When we were kids, that game was impossible. And, you know, as you got older and started to talk about, oh, hey, remember those old games we used to play? Man, that was always one that popped up that was like, that was impossible. Never owned it as a kid, but I had friends that had it, and so I got a lot of experience with it. And it wasn't until I started collecting games. But even then, when I found it in my collection about 15 years ago, when I started collecting, it was one of those things where I popped it in and I was like, man, this is as hard as I remember it. And it's frustrating, and I rage quit. But about 5 years ago, I decided I'm going to get really good at this game. So I decided over the course of a week, you know, I'm just going to do nothing but play it. I did do other things, but you know what I mean. I just started playing the game over and over and over again, dying a lot, but eventually I got good at it. And eventually I beat it. And man, that was an amazing accomplishment. Oh, well, God. And man, it was such a great feeling being able to finally beat a game that you've been trying so hard to beat for so very long. And when that actually happened, I was like, well, now I'm going to get really good at the game, and now I'm actually kind of a badass at it. But after I ended up beating, I decided, you know what, I'm going to get really good at the game, and I started getting it to where now I can pop that thing and phrase this correctly, and complete it, beat it every time sometimes without even dying, only like one or two times. So yeah, absolutely. Ninja Gaiden, one of the best games on the NES in my opinion, one of the hardest, and one that I'm the most proud of that I can beat, but it did take me a very long time to do. Now I just need to get on the ball and beat Ninja Turtles 1. That game is, and Battletoads. That's it. That's an impossible game too. Maybe that's next. Nah, there's no way I can do that. Thanks for having me on.
The immortal John Hancock, and boy, do I have a great story to share with you about a game that's been in my collection a long time before I beat it. And the game I'm talking about today is Gain Ground. This is an arcade port for the Sega Genesis, and a game that I've had in my collection probably since the mid to late 90s. I got it from Ray's Video in Chico, California. I still have the sticker on the back of my cart to prove it. And this is a game I played, I popped in, checked out, but never really sat down and fully appreciated the Sega Genesis port. It has 50 levels. Well, fast forward to a couple years ago when I typically had a tradition with a good friend of mine, and we would get together. He would pick something out of my game collection. We'd sit down and play through the game. And so he chose Gain Ground, and we sat down and played through all 50 levels of this co-op. And this is an amazing game, especially two-player. There's a lot of action and strategy, and I highly recommend it. And so, you know, I don't know, so mid-90s up to like 2018, and there you go. That's a long time to have a game in a collection before beating it entirely. Great game, great port, check it out.
Way back in 1988, I was 12 years old, and a friend of mine got the NES port of Rampage. That game, of course, was a popular quarter-munching co-op arcade game. And oftentimes, those quarter-munching arcade games don't translate well to the home market, and the NES port got very repetitive very quickly, and my friend got bored with it very quickly. But in my neighborhood, if you had a video game, you had currency, because you could go to somebody else's house and swap games with them for a couple of days, and we often did that, and we coordinate our game purchases given how much these games cost. In fact, this copy of Metroid actually belongs to some kid from the neighborhood, so I should probably get in touch with him at some point. So I would get Rampage from my buddy and try to get through as much of it as I could before I had to give the game back to him. And I never finished it, of course, just because it gets repetitive and really long. And I never actually knew how many levels there were. But fast forward to about 2 or 3 years ago, and a different friend of mine was in town, and he wanted to check out my Analog NT Mini, so we hunted through the library for a fun co-op game we could play for an hour or two, and my friend settled on Rampage because it was one of his favorite games from 30-something years ago. So we started playing, and before we knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and we were on level 80. And we decided finally to look and see how many levels there were, and sure enough, there are 128 levels. And we said, well, we're halfway through it. We may as well just stick with the game here and see how far we can get. So we did, and about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, we finished the game. Unfortunately, the ending is really not worth staying up that late for, but we did it, and I'm quite proud of that.
So I personally love this question because I think it's something that everyone can relate to, whether or not it's the difficulty of a game or just the sheer length. And these two games for me are RPGs, and they took me way too long to beat. The first one was Final Fantasy VII, and I started that when it first came out. I bought it new at Software Etc. actually, played it on PC while all my friends were playing on the PlayStation 1 version. I thought the graphics were awesome on PC, I thought it was totally superior, and then my game crashed and I actually lost my save file about 40 hours in. So I didn't start that again till at least 10 years later on PlayStation 1, and I slowly went through that game, and it took me like, I don't know, at least 8 years before I finished it. Great game, clearly, but I was way late to the party because once you lose your save file, you know, it really takes the wind out of your sails. The other one that I thought I'd mention is Earthbound, because I've been working on this game for so long, it's hilarious. I love this game, and I always go back to it and play it like an hour or two here and there, but I just don't commit enough time to finish it. I'm really far, but ironically, I've also lost my save file on this thing, so sometimes that setback is so drastic that it makes you just want to throw your hands up in the air. But anyway, this is one reason why I'm very selective about the RPGs I jump into, especially if they're really long, because I just need to have the time to finish them, and I don't like having RPGs hanging that I haven't finished. So anyway, that's my answer.
So for me, the game that immediately comes to mind is Final Fantasy X. Now, when I first played that game, I made the mistake of trying to play it casually, trying to play it for the story. I was having a good time, got to the end, and just got spanked. I was pissed because I didn't level grind, and so I threw the controller down and swore that game off, said I was never gonna finish it. But man, you know how a game kind of just eats at the back of your mind? You know what you have to do to beat it. So I think it was about a year later that I came back to it. I did all the level grinding, got to the point where I could confidently beat the end boss, and I totally did, and felt pretty good about that until I saw that ending, which I was like, I'm not gonna spoil the game, but if you've beaten Final Fantasy X, you know that ending is a little bit like, what? What was that all about? So I don't know if it was worth it or not, but that's my answer. So that was a really great question, and I love all the different answers that we had in this video. And a huge thank you to all the creators who helped make this video. I highly recommend you go check out what they're working on because they're all doing really cool stuff, and I'll put a link down in the video description below. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.